Okay, thank you everyone who decided to stay. I really appreciate it. We're going to be talking tonight about the FTC and that scintillating, very exciting topic about how it can really mess up your day or how you can save yourself and your company. So I'm just going to start with every 39 seconds a breach occurs, right? Actually, you know what? Let me take a step back. I normally give this kind of talk to business owners. You guys are a little bit different, and you're actually the kind of crowd I like to speak with because this is where I came from. I'm an IT guy. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But where I came from was developing applications and developing infrastructure for my customers. So when I say every 39 seconds a breach occurs, in the business world, they don't necessarily understand that. But you guys have probably heard this, and you already know that cyber attacks are really expensive, and protection is even more expensive. And if it's not done right, it's a waste of money. But compliance fines, they can cripple a small business. And developers build the systems that keep the data safe or don't. So regulators will hold your company accountable. I'm going to talk a little bit more about attacks, but is everybody aware of the fact that cybercrime makes up 10% of the global GDP today? Does anybody know that? It's a pretty big, compelling argument that 10 cents out of every dollar is involved in cybercrime or is taken out in cybercrime. So who am I? My name is Howard Globus. I'm the CEO of IT On Demand. It's actually the third IT business I've owned. The first one crashed and burned spectacularly. We went bankrupt. Second business got rolled into IT On Demand, and I focus on cybersecurity and compliance structures. I started in this industry when I was 7 years old. We had a computer at home before I had a color television. This was it. I'm sure some of you know this is a TRS-80 Model 1, Trash 80. The tape deck is where we used to store our programs. The thing that I want to make sure that I'm expressing, though, is my brother and I, he's 2 years younger than I am, we had to learn how to program, and we had to demonstrate that we could before we could do things like go out and ride bikes or do other things that we wanted to do with our friends. So we grew up in a household where we were programming and we were working with equipment. Fast forward a couple of years, my dad owned a computer consulting firm, and as teenagers, my brother and I both worked in the business. We used to clean out CPUs. I don't know if anybody remembers, but people used to smoke in offices, and they had these big, thick chunks of crap that used to accumulate. We would take care of those. So as I grew up and got older, I decided I never wanted to be in IT, and I never wanted to own my own business. And yet I've owned 3 of them, and for the last 30 plus years, I work in IT. So that happened through a series that I don't really want to go into right now unless somebody wants to have a therapy session with me at the bar later on. But the long and the short of it is what I found is I knew how to do IT, and I started working for fund managers. We started doing things like providing security for them when they were first rolling out those machines. We pulled cable for the original Bloomberg terminals, coax cable, and we had to figure out how to do file sharing and things like that. And that's really where I came up. Then in 2007, we had an incident, and it started out as a normal day. My train was late. Somebody spilled some coffee on me. But by the end of the day, people were leaving the office with boxes of their stuff and their deal tombstones in boxes. They were out of the game because they didn't have everything in the know. And what we said was, my partner and I, we never wanted to go through that again. We retooled what IT On Demand was going to be at that point in time. Last year, we had the same feeling. Imagine this. Imagine somebody wires $1.4 million from an operating account into a hacker's account, and then it gets moved along. A client of mine came to me, they were a prospect at the time, and they had the right firewalls, they had the right antivirus, but they didn't have all the critical pieces in place. And my goal from that point on was how to keep these folks in the game. Because when they came to me, they said, how do we get this money back? You don't. That million and change is gone. So we want to talk about how we make sure that folks are not wasting money. How do they stay secure? How do they stay safe? I'm going to rewind for a moment again. Does everybody know what the FTC is, the Federal Trade Commission? Okay. So basically they're entrusted with protecting consumers. And really what they're trying to do is make sure that companies that are out there in the environment are not doing the wrong thing. And the wrong thing is different today than it was in 1929 when the stock market crashed, or when the Glass-Steagall Act was originally passed, or, for about 70 years when they did nothing except, we went ahead and we had split the atom, we went to the moon, we created the personal computer, and we had the internet, but there was a period of time when the FTC made no updates or changes. So in 1999, Congress passed the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. Has anybody heard of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act? Okay. Yes, good. Anybody else? The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act basically gave the FTC the responsibility of implementing the types of regulations that they were talking about. So the original act was passed and then implemented for May 23rd of 2020, and then it went into effect in May 2003. So what it did was it applied a new set of financial controls to institutions, and it was primarily financial institutions, just to be clear. They have protections and disclosure requirements based on the technology of the time. Again, the early 2000s. The problem is, this really didn't solve anyone's problems, right? We still had the Gramm-Leach-Bliley is very often amended to or shortened to GLBA. GLBA was very unclear. It didn't have any teeth. There was no enforcement mechanism. Anybody have to deal with HIPAA compliance? Has anybody heard of HIPAA compliance? When I was an MSP owner, we were like, HIPAA compliance is going to be the thing, because that's going to go ahead and save our business. We're going to go and talk to doctors and dentists who said for years that they didn't want to do anything. Now that they have a HIPAA compliance requirement, now they're going to do something. Turns out there are no HIPAA police, and basically, unless you're a big firm or you're a hospital, they go ahead and they don't even bother with it. So very similarly, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act didn't have any teeth. So in 2008, Heartland Payment Systems, they lost 135 million credit cards. Seems like a lot. 2013, does anybody remember the Experian subsidiary that had about 200 million records leaked? It's a patch of Apache servers that needed to happen that sort of did, sort of didn't, kind of didn't. And in 2019, First American Financial Corporation had almost 1 billion records leaked, right? So there were no teeth. There was nothing that was happening. So another example was auto dealers. Let me just take you out of the financial services for a moment and talk about auto dealers. Auto dealers have the same level of data as banks when they're doing loans or when they're doing financing. They have a high turnover rate. The employees are not trained in security. They're not even trained in banking. They're trained in sales. They have razor-thin margins, so they constantly want to churn, and it's easy target for hackers. I have a question. Has anybody bought a car or a truck in the last couple of years? Anyone? Okay. When you went to the dealership and they, said that you wanted to do a test drive, and you gave them your license. Sorry, in New York, that's what you have to do. You have to give them your license, and then you go for the drive, and you come back, and then you have to remind the salesperson to give you your license back. Or don't worry, I made a photocopy of it. Oh, that makes me feel so much better. Thank you. I'm glad that you made a photocopy of my license. Or I left it on the photocopy machine, but don't worry. Okay. they had very little requirements to keep data safe. Because the technology landscape of today is different than it was at the turn of the century, some changes happened. So in December of 2021, the FTC upgraded their rules, and the biggest upgrade was called the Safeguard Rule. And the Safeguard Rule made some huge changes. It expanded the definition of a financial institution. So this is an example. This is the original text of the Safeguard Rule. This is the new text. Okay, I actually will have a link for you for the Safeguard Rule, so you don't have to read that right now. But an example of the entities that are covered, I think, are really important to think about. Mortgage lenders, that makes sense. They're like banks. Payday lenders, okay, also a little bit like banks. Finance companies, auto, home, but also if you happen to finance your sofa or your television. Mortgage brokers, account servicers, check cashing locations, wire transfer sites, some travel agencies, depending upon how they're doing their services, real estate appraisers, credit counselors, automotive dealerships, tax preparation firms. This was a big one. The CPAs didn't realize that they now have to do it. If they have more than 500 records, they have to be Gramm-Leach-Bliley compliant. And non-federally insured credit unions. This is a huge change. All of these types of companies and organizations now have to follow the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. Okay, so we know who the who is. What's the what? The FTC safeguards, they were created to protect the security, confidentiality, and integrity of the customer information, right? Basically, anything that's non-public has to be secured. So they established what the parameters of a good customer's, what good customer data hygiene is. They also created consequences for not maintaining that hygiene. Companies that now meet the guidelines are required to do things like develop, implement, and maintain comprehensive information security programs. Now, what that means is not talk about it or have an idea of it, but it has to be written down and it has to be available when it's requested for. You have to have controls in place, and those controls need to be tested on a regular basis. You need to be able to explain what's going on, so documentation is critical. The objectives of this program are to ensure the security and confidentiality of the customer data, but also to protect about any threats that you've anticipated or haven't anticipated. You want to protect against the unauthorized access of the customer's data. So you can't leave the driver's license on the photocopy machine when you go out for a 20-minute test drive. Okay, so the security program's objectives have to ensure that customer information is secure, protect against any unanticipated threats. Same slide. So a lot of times, the FTC actually goes back and they use Section 5 to go ahead and enforce what it is that they're doing. Section 5 basically says unfair or deceptive acts. So saying that we secure the data but we're not doing it, that's a deceptive act. So if you are a provider that says we secure our customers' data on the website and then you have a data breach, that's a deceptive act. So even after you have a ransomware event, you're then going to get visited by the FTC and have an additional fine. If you have a data breach, expect an investigation to occur. And the reason why these things happen is that's where the money is. I want to stress that this is a business problem. I don't see this as an IT or developer problem. This is a business problem. We know that human error is a major factor in cyber attacks. 9 out of every 10 attacks start with a phishing or business email compromise. So it's easier to give hackers access than we think. It's easier to give hackers access than most business owners think. You folks probably know exactly how easy it is to give people access. But what does this mean for the software development community? The threat is coming from inside the house. Compliance requirements means that we need to make sure that we have solid code, it's secure, and that we're doing things that, we probably learned about when we first started programming, when we first started a mentorship program, when somebody said, turn off the ports that aren't going to be used. Make sure you're checking your data. Do you need to retain that data? Right? Things that we know we should do, but as we're developing and as we're writing code, it's very easy to forget that because I got to get this piece of the project done. I have to go ahead and make sure that this is actually functioning properly. So things like encryption at rest and in transit, of course, right? I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Role-based access controls, again, least privilege access, make sure that you have role-based access controls. Don't depend on putting an individual user in, try and do it by group. Audit logs and monitoring, right? Of course, we need to have our audit logs and monitoring set up. I go and see all the time that it's not done, but we know we need to do it. Data minimization, collecting only the data that we need and don't collect or retain the data that you don't use. Secure APIs, strong workflow, very simply put is MFA when I talk with business owners who are not technical. What happens if we don't actually build it? Again, the Heartland payment breach came up with 135 million cards stolen. I'm going to take a little bit of a segue here, and I like to do a visualization, right? I'm not asking you to close your eyes. That's not really my gig, but I do want to visualize for you what this kind of thing means. Hacking is big business, right? It was a $1 trillion industry. That was in 2017. So I like to walk people through this. If this is $100, right? This is what $10,000 looks like in your hand. This is what $1 million looks like in your hand. A pallet would contain approximately $100 million. Okay, so this is about $1 billion. This is the equivalent of $1 trillion, right? So visually, you have little guy right over here, 2 pallets high, stacked that much. That's what $1 trillion looks like. What I want to talk about, though, is 2019 is when we actually hit, sorry, not 2017, 2019 is when we hit the 1 trillion mark. IBM put out a report in 2023 that said that by 2025, the expectation is cyber crime was going to be approximately 10.5 trillion. Forrester said it was about 12.5. Right now, we're on track for it to be about 11.5 for 2025. But let's use the 10.5 number because global GDP is going to be about 105 trillion. So that's about 10%. It's a nice, easy round number. So what does 10.5 trillion look like? If this is 1 trillion, this is what 10.5 trillion looks like. The reason why I like to kind of show that as a photo or as an image is if you look at it, the United States, then China, then cybercrime. It's huge business. So although when we talk about things like making sure that we don't collect data that we don't need or encryption of data at rest and in transit, right? Those are old saws that we all know we need to do. Are we doing them? Because it's a big amount of money at risk here. The Experian leak is another one that I just wanted to revisit on. Again, 200 million records leaked. As we know, as I mentioned, as a couple of you in the room already know, that was some poorly patched Apache code, right? And it wasn't even on all the servers. It was on some of the servers and servers that a couple of people had thought were decommissioned. So knowing what's out there is important. I talk about this, when I do this talk with business owners, I talk about the fact that the tone from the top is the most important thing. You have to have a culture of security. It can't just be, we need to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. We need to be talking about it as an immersive cultural experience. So leadership needs to talk the talk. However, stories sell. And I'm going to tell you a couple of stories tonight because I think that they will help put some hooks that you can then use when you talk to either your management partners, your management, or your board. Because going and saying we need to, harden this product because it's the right thing to do may not hold the same level of saliency. Has anybody heard of Drizzly? Anybody know what Drizzly is? Okay. So in 2011, a guy by the name of John Corey Rellis started a firm. And his idea was, I want to deliver alcohol to folks at home. It's a little bit ahead of his time, but he ran into some problems with the state regulations. I'm from New York. You can't buy hard liquor in a grocery store. You can't buy it in a 7-Eleven or a convenience store. You have to buy it in a liquor store. You can buy beer. You can't buy wine. California, you can buy a lot of this. Different regulations. I mean, Louisiana has drive-through daiquiris. So it's a different regulations, different places, right? But Drizzly was like, let's see if we can affect the local laws and make it easier to deliver alcohol. And they were on a pretty good clip. And they had a really good business model. So good that in 2021, Uber bought them. They were acquired fully by Uber. Now, in part, that's because of the pandemic, and a lot of places in the country was shut down. In New York, like I said, you can't buy alcohol anywhere, but you now can, today even, you can go to your local taqueria, your burger joint, and if they sell alcohol in-house, you can actually get alcohol to takeaway, which you couldn't do prior to the pandemic. But a lot of restaurants were failing, and they were trying to bolster them, and that's why they came up with this idea. That's a little bit of an aside. Drizzly was still selling alcohol. If you had your card on file and your identification, your driver's license on file, they would pick up a fifth of rum, a fifth of tequila, and they drop it by your house, party on, right? It's a great model. John Rellis had a little bit of a problem. John Rellis was the CEO of Drizzly, but before he was the CEO of Drizzly, he was also the CIO of another firm. That'll be important when we come back to it in just a minute. The FTC went and started an investigation of Drizzly, and in 2020, they started this investigation, and in 2023, they came around and they said, okay, Drizzly had a breach where they lost 2.5 million customer records, credit cards, dates of birth, driver's licenses, right? Personal information. And so they fined Drizzly. Well, Drizzly was already owned by Uber, so Drizzly was like, no big deal. Except the FTC, for the first time ever, named a chief executive officer as liable for this breach. They specifically named John Rellis. Now, here's the thing about that. They made them put certain programs in place, so if they have over 25,000 customer records, they now need to do certain things. Uber has many more than that, so they have to do certain compliance activities, and they have to report back on a quarterly basis. But they went further than that. They actually attached, and I grew up in an era where the threat in school was this is going to go down on your permanent record. I found out that that's not really true, except John Rellis now has a permanent record. The FTC said that any publicly traded firm that he now works for, where he is a C-level executive, and they have more than 2,500 customer records, they need to put in the same safety measures as are being required for Drizzly. He also has to state to the board and to the shareholders that he has had breaches. Turns out, in his first company when he was CIO, he also had a breach. And he failed to report it in a timely fashion, and it cost quite a bit of money. But the FTC said that from now on, all the C-suite executives of Drizzly now need to be on notice for this. John was named specifically. John's 45. He's already started 2 firms. He's probably going to start another one, maybe a third. By the way, Drizzly, Uber decided that it was too much of a pain in the ass, and they closed them down. They're still delivering alcohol under Uber Eats and other things, but they're not using the Drizzly name, the Drizzly model, and Drizzly no longer exists except as a warning to others. I use this story specifically when I speak with business owners because they're very often like, that's an IT problem. That's a developer problem, right? Somebody else is going to have to deal with this. No. And I want you to take this story as something that you can bring back to your board or to your executives or to your management team to say that these things need to be taken seriously because the FTC is taking these things seriously. And it doesn't really matter if the breach is because somebody inherited bad code, somebody bought a smaller firm and they're integrating in. It doesn't matter. Once you guys own it, it's now going to be something that your management team needs to be aware of. So when some of the other talking points are things like this feature may create a compliance gap under Gramm-Leach-Bliley FTC rules. That's a very dry way of putting it. I would refer back to a story, right? Specifically, things like the Drizzly event. We need time to build proper encryption and access controls. Again, looking at the Drizzly event. Or you could look at Blackbaud. Does anybody know Blackbaud? Has anybody heard of Blackbaud? No? Okay. Blackbaud is a cloud, or was a cloud service provider. They sold services to not-for-profit companies, educational institutions, and healthcare orgs. In May of 2020, they got hit with a ransomware event, and they had about 13,000 customers. They got social security number. The ransomware generated data exfiltration. Some of the stuff that was taken was social security numbers, bank accounts, personal health information. Ultimately, they came to a $3 million settlement. Great, no problem. Then they ended up agreeing to a $49.5 million settlement with 49 states and the District of Columbia. In 2025, this is still ongoing. The things that they suffered from, no data encryption, they had an inadequate network segmentation, they had they delayed the detection and response. The attack occurred in February of 2020. They didn't report it until May of 2020. So a lot of time passed. And they had poor disclosure practices. This resulted in them actually ending up going out, right? So it's another firm, not huge, but it's another firm that got hit because they went down from FTC regulations. Our vendor must sign a data security agreement. That's required. That's another good way that we usually talk about this. We talk about the fact that when working with customers or vendors, they need to make sure that they're providing the same level of security that you're providing internally. And one way to do this is having your vendor sign a data security agreement. You can talk about recommending a risk assessment. It's one of the tools that we recommend our clients and customers use. It's a way of doing a security assessment not only on their own tools, on their own apps, but also supply chain, because you're only as strong as your weakest link. And if one of your vendors is not in a good spot and you're pulling data from them, you may actually be pulling bad data. And not just bad data, but data that causes a problem. Another example I like to use is Snowflake. Has anybody heard of Snowflake? Okay. So a couple of people raised their hands. Snowflake is a data warehousing firm. In 2024, a group called UNC 3944 breached these guys. They only got data from about 165 customers, so it's not like a huge amount of customers. Except their customers are AT&T, Ticketmaster, LendingTree, Advanced Auto Parts, Neiman Marcus. The firm stores and analyzes large volumes of data for enterprise customers. And the ransom started because they had this malware and phishing. They had phishing that started, and a malware got deployed, and that's how everything kicked off. You may know UNC 3944 better by Scattered Spider. Has anybody heard of them? Yeah, they're responsible for things like MGM Grand, Truist, MGM Grand Resorts, Marks and Spencer. They've hit many, many, many companies. When they hit these companies, they leave a wake of problems. I talk about MGM Grand. It's not specifically a developer's hack or software hack, but it is a social engineering hack. I actually find it fascinating because the wetware is still the place where we have our weakest link. And it's something that even when we harden the applications we develop, we need to make sure that we're doing training for all the end users, the help desk, the support people in our organization. That being said, that's not the focus of this talk, but when speaking about these things, I would say also bring that up. I recommend having a bench of stories, right? These stories are go-tos that you can use to help highlight what's going on. So things like the Morgan Stanley hack from 2021, right? It was a $60 million fine. The Capital One hack, again from 2019, it was an $80 million fine. Nationwide Mutual Insurance, they only lost $5.5 million through a settlement, so that was pretty good for them. Flagstar Bank, they had another one. Okay, I often hear this though, especially when I talk to business owners, we're not a bank. We don't really have to think about these kinds of things like this. That's why I like to use some other go-to safeguard compliance stories. So Dwelling Mortgage, small firm, like literally a couple of dozen people, they got breached in 2020. They had failure to reasonably maintain their customers' data. TaxSlayer, again, not a bank. They had a similar problem where they had a weak access to their web application, and they're now on a 20-year compliance monitoring program with the FTC. That's assuming they stay in business. I like to say that compliance is everyone's responsibility. It's something that we need to talk about and make sure that we're sharing across the organization. And it's not just the folks who are providing the infrastructure, or the folks who are providing the computers, or the folks who are developing the applications. It's everyone. Everyone in the organization has to take responsibility for it, not just an IT or a legal issue. This slide is one that we usually use for business owners, non-technical people, some actions that they can take, some practical steps for developers. And again, you guys know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I'm just reminding you. Write secure code, input validation, escape injections, use up-to-date libraries. I mean, that was the Apache hack, right, for Experian. Encrypt sensitive data by default. When we do audits of our customers or our prospects, we very often find that data, even data that's sitting in databases or in applications, is not encrypted by default. Running tests for the vulnerabilities. Have a team inside that's, whether you do it yearly, quarterly, or more regularly or less regularly, have some kind of regular vulnerability and testing going on. There has to be a way of reporting security concerns in a timely fashion that's not going to cause people to feel like they're going to get fired or actually get fired. Because the fact is that if the tone comes from the top and the management team and the leaders and the folks who are working with the developers are looking at this stuff and saying, how can I get the best information from the people in the field? The only way to do that is have a good, timely way of getting that information and not have it be something that people are going to fear being fired for. This is the most, in my opinion, the most important piece. Document everything. I'm sure none of you do this, but the self-documenting code that has a line that says, this does that, with no reference and no idea about what other libraries are being called or where the data actually resides or how it's happening, I've never had to debug any of those kind of applications. I'm sure you haven't either. But going further, when changes are made, are there minutes of meetings about why this update happened? Is there a discussion about the fact that we're going to have an encryption set going forward? How that's going to be implemented? Who's responsible for it? Having it documented can save you from when you have to defend this in a legal environment. I usually talk about common cyber threats and warning signs. I'm not going to do that right here. I'd appreciate your feedback on this talk. I will be taking some questions in a few moments if there are any, but I put together a couple of resources. I put together a story deck of about 5 different companies. 3 of them we already talked about. I also have a very simple 2-page sheet of design do's and, do's, whether you're designing the software yourself or if you are inheriting an application. Again, as I said, I'm sure this is stuff you already know, but if you just put it up someplace, somewhere that somebody can look at it occasionally and go, yeah, we should do that, it's a good reminder. And then finally, I have another set of stories that are on the larger side. So these are the Morgan Stanley Experian type stories. Internal policies are critical, making sure that these policies are up to date and that there are ways to gather this information, store it, and report back on it. This is a link to the FTC safeguards rule. This is the actual link right here. There's a shortened link. I never trust a shortened link, and I never trust QR codes, but you're welcome to try. I'm sure it's not a rickroll. Some final takeaways. You write the code that protects the customer data. You can help the company avoid fines and reputational damage. Ask questions, raise your concerns, because security is everyone's responsibility. So with that, I'm going to open it up to any questions that you have.
So these regulations and these fines are limited to financial institutions in the expanded definition of that, right? Like all the examples you had customer financial data.
Yeah.
Correct?
No, they're not limited to financial institutions. They actually, one of the things that it's health institutions as well, but also under safeguards section 5, any customer or any company that is interacting with the public, they have up on their website, we take our customers' data seriously. They're under section 5.
Gotcha. So even if I don't feel like it classifies that kind of a business owner, I have data. I tell people in any way, shape, or form that we protect it. I'm liable to get fined if we have.
Potentially correct. Yep.
Any other questions?
I mean, he's still doing a demo in the other room if you want to see that.
So is there anything that being done like towards the infrastructure area? Because I've seen a lot of privately owned, publicly owned facilities like water plants along those lines. I mean, they're still using hardware from the 80s that's got approved by those passwords published on the internet for the last 20 years. I mean, they literally couldn't whistleblow hard enough about our public infrastructure.
I'm in agreement with you on that. I'm trying to figure out what the question was. Does everybody remember the Colonial Pipeline incident? Colonial Pipeline, sort of, kind of. So the answer to your question is that there are some infrastructure-related concerns, and that's actually an excellent point. I have a different deck that talks about how to harden the infrastructure, but Colonial Pipeline is a perfect example. So Colonial Pipeline provides a pipeline that goes from the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf, just leave it at that, up the East Coast. And up the East Coast, and at different locations, it has drop-off points. And the Colonial Pipeline system got hacked. The way that it got hacked was there was an old pumping station that had a network-attached piece of equipment that hadn't been serviced in a number of years, and the admin password was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's very complex. Almost nobody would think of that. And what happened was they shut down that pipe distribution, and it was a cascading series of problems. My mother-in-law lives, well, she's moving in with us, so that's not true. My mother-in-law lived in North Carolina at the time, and she sent me photos of people having plastic bags. You know, like when you go to a takeout restaurant, like really cheap, flimsy red or yellow plastic bags. People were filling up gasoline from the pumps into these bags and putting them in the trunk or the deck of their pickup trucks because the pipeline was drying up. And it was in the beginning of the summer, and there was a real concern that when it made it up to Newark, this is before Newark was having problems with their flight data, if it made it up to Newark, jet fuel was no longer going to be available, and it was going to grind that hub to a screeching halt. Ultimately, this was a hardware problem. This was a password problem of an old piece of hardware. There is hardening that needs to be done. From a municipal perspective, there are a lot of municipalities that have not upgraded their infrastructure. They're still using old pumps, old tools, and what they're finding is that they're getting compromised. Now, that's whether it's a chemical plant, water treatment plant, sewage plant, electricity distribution plant. They're all having these kinds of issues. In 2019, I believe, there was a grant program that was opened up for local municipalities to upgrade their infrastructure for cybersecurity. Grants were submitted, people applied for them, towns, counties, cities got those grants, and then they promptly used them for other things that were deemed as cybersecurity programs that were not really cybersecurity specific, right? They had a cybersecurity aspect, but they were not cybersecurity specific. And as a result, you're still finding plants that have old hardware with rooted passwords that are easily available on the internet. It's a problem. It's a real problem. And I think, again, not to get political, I think that the next couple of years are going to be a real trial for us because CISA has been significantly curtailed, right? It's been gutted. That's a program that was on the forefront of educating small and medium-sized business owners and counties, states, local authorities to make sure that they were checking for things. I think what we're going to find is a number of big events, and then we're going to have a real change that happens as a result of that. Yeah. Hi.
Just for curiosity's sake, have you ever heard of a very significant data breach that happened with a company that was completely FTC compliant?
I think that the answer to the question is there ever a company that's completely FTC compliant? As with most of these things, so I've been through a couple of hundred audits with different customers that I've been. I've worked at some very large banks, some very large reinsurance firms. I've worked at some very small startups on these things. And when they're audited, auditors never find nothing, right? There's always something to find. And the way that we talk about cybersecurity in general is it's a constant improvement, right? It's never a static, it gets to green and then we're done. Likewise, the FTC findings, I've seen a couple of of companies that have had all their I's dotted and their T's crossed, and they still got breached and they still have problems. Their fines were not as significant. That's the main thing. What I like to say today is we're all going to get hit at some point in time. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And we talk a lot about having disaster recovery plans and incident response plans in place. Those are required as part of the FTC requirements. If you have an incident response plan and a disaster recovery plan in place, business continuity plan is also how it can be phrased, and you can show that you're doing best efforts to bring things back around, you're going to be in a much better spot when the investigators come, because the investigators are going to come. There was an insurance firm, I think it was Philadelphia Insurance, but I don't remember the exact name, last week or the week before. They sell a lot of cyber insurance. They got hit with a ransomware event last week. They clearly know what to do. They communicated with all of their customers. I only know this because I'm a member of a group where a number of people brought it up. But they communicated with all their customers. They let them know what they were doing, and they kept them in a good comms plan to keep them up to date about where things are. My expectation is that fine from the FTC is going to be minimal. Not nothing, but it's going to be minimal. Does that answer the question, or?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Yes, just wanted to inquire if there's any regulatory changes you would hope to see in the future. Is there any other countries that are doing this sort of thing better than we are? And what's something we could expect if we were to make positive changes in this space? What would it look like?
So the European Union has a lot of problems with things that they do. But one of the things that they've gotten right, at least from a compliance perspective, is the right to be forgotten and GDPR as a general concept. I think that the reason why that works as well as it does, or why it helps in some of these other areas that we're talking about, is there's not data just hanging around. And not having it's like having, cloths soaked in linseed oil stored in your garage, or a lot of kindling that's just left right by, a debris pile. It's less likely to catch fire if it's not there. So if the data's not there, if people are requesting the data not be there, it winds up solving the problem. The problem is and just to be clear, I've owned businesses and I am definitely a capitalist. The problem is that in a capitalist society, the way that we make money is by buying and selling stuff. And the way that we buy and sell stuff is having people's information about what kind of stuff people want to buy. So it's not likely that regulations are going to come along to allow that information to be destroyed easily. I think information destruction would make it a lot easier to stay safe. I think that the fines being significant also provide some impetus to actually do the work to keep things safer, right? The problem is it's not uniform. And I think that uniformity is probably the thing that we're going to need. And my expectation is in the next 20 years, where the digital natives actually are writing policy and aware, it's more likely that we're going to see impactful changes, as opposed to folks who really can't fathom how somebody gets a pop-up ad knowing exactly what it is that they want to buy, and it's tailored exactly to them to buy it. That information requires, to send those kinds of pop-ups, you need to have the information, and that information can only be destroyed if you're in the EU at this point in time. Significantly destroyed. Obviously, there are other ways to request it, but I know that's not a satisfactory answer. But I think that the change in culture is really going to come from digital natives who understand where some of this stuff lies. Sorry, was there another? Yep.
Then I'm cutting in front of you. So I'm a computer science educator, and I really liked this talk, and it got me thinking, in a very limited amount of time we have in a degree program, Like, what do you think are the most important skills that we could give students in this area before we're getting them out the door to try to get them, employed somewhere?
So can you phrase that again? Who are the students that you're getting out the door?
So usually computer science programming students, 2-year degree, or they're going to transfer somewhere and continue.
Okay. So maybe it's different than when I grew up, but we always were programming as quickly as we could to figure out a problem, and we weren't really looking at cleaning up after ourselves. And that was whether we were programming or we were network engineering or Active Directory developers, where it was like, yeah, we'll fix that later. Cleaning up your mess as you go is a really good topic to instill and to talk about it and to talk about why, right? Because I think that human beings like to know the why of things rather than just being told that they need to do it. Being able to bulletproof code is important, but being able to have a small attack surface area as possible makes it less likely that you're going to actually have a problem. So clean up as you go. That's something that I would really recommend. Test, least privilege access. I still think that, at least from the coding that I've seen, and again, I'm sure it doesn't happen here, but the coding that I've seen, people are still trying to give as much access as possible rather than trying to figure out how to thread the needle and do it with the least amount of privilege possible, because it's a pain in the ass, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is we want the program to work or the application to work. We're less concerned about some of the other niceties of it, but making sure that we clean up as we go and that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. And those are the three concepts I would really talk about. Is that helpful? Sure.
Has the FTC ever gone after the platform as a service or the cloud providers with any of the regulations? Found them liable for any of the breaches? Most of them, I've found that they guide you toward best practices security. They don't require it.
Yeah. So the answer is no. Let me say this. As far as I know, the answer is no. It's kind of like we give them the platform and they have to do what they're supposed to do with it. When we do investigations for our customers, when they're going through a SOC 2, Type 2, or even a Type 1, and they need to pull some data like the SOC reports from Amazon Web Services or Azure Web Services, right? They can get that, and that shows that the platform is secure. And then it's up to the developer or the owner of the application, or even if they're not developing anything, the owner of the information to secure it. And I'm almost positive that the answer is no. And the reason why I also know this is, for the longest time when I had an MSP and we were selling services, one of the things we talked about with everybody is, yes, you have your email and your data up on SharePoint and Microsoft 365, and that's what's hosting your email now. You no longer have an Exchange server, or you have it on Google Workspace and you have all your data there. Both Microsoft and Google highly recommend that customers back up their data. They say that they're only responsible for retrieving data the last 30 days. After that, it's best effort, but they explicitly state in their terms of service that they're not responsible for that data. So I would find it difficult to believe that the FTC would have too much luck. If company A had a breach and they said, well, we were secure, we were using Amazon's web services or Azure services, they go and point back to their terms of service and say, you're responsible for hardening your environment.